across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View. Might just mention yesterday was a taped program, but we are live for the rest of the week. And those of you that are still digging out from what we call inclement weather, I hope that you will listen, especially since we will be talking about some very important issues, not only this hour, but next hour. We'll get into, again, what's going on in Minnesota and a very good piece by Jonathan Turley, as well as one later on we'll talk about from Professor Robert George, has been on the program, How to Keep Our Republic. So I think you will appreciate that. But our first hour is going to be really focusing on something that we've talked about before, but it's worth revisiting, and that is how you can take a stand for the future of faith and freedom. And that is what is oftentimes referred to as, of course, this F3 organization, which is associated with First Liberty Institute. The F3 initiative is something that Nathan Shackelford, I should say, has put together, Shaun Frederickson, and as well as a number of other individuals being a part of this. And so I thought we might spend some time talking about some of these issues. And if you would like to make some comments, you can certainly leave emails and all the rest. We are, as you might imagine, working with a smaller crew. And so as a result, don't have as many opportunities to take your phone call today as we will by tomorrow. So again, this is a live broadcast on Tuesday. And let me just bring Nathan Shackelford to the program. He's the Associate General Counsel and Director of the Future of Faith and Freedom Initiative at First Liberty, graduate of Texas A&M, and has his law degree from Southern Methodist University. And Nathan, thank you for joining us again here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I might also mention that we have Shaun Frederickson with us. He's a speaker, a writer, a content creator, serves as the development officer for the F3 initiative for First Liberty Institute. Last time we talked with him, we talked about some of the ways in which he, through some of his speaking, produced two different anti-lockdown events there in California, and joins us now by phone. Shaun, welcome as well.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Nathan, let me come to you first, because I suspect that many of our listeners maybe have heard us talk about this, especially in our Friday roundtable. But we do have a link to a couple of things. First of all, you can go to the F3 landing page by going to First Liberty, then /F3. Or of course, we also have a link to joinf3.org. And as people go to those websites, can you maybe give us a background on the origin of F3 and why this is something that we encourage young people to get a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I think really what we've seen across the country is that there's a wave of kind of next generation people that want to do something. And when you're in college, there's so many good opportunities to get involved with good organizations that are doing great things. And then you get out of that and they're really kind of disappears from there. There's not a whole lot of groups that are looking to bring in kind of that next generation of 20s to 40s to help them understand their rights, what they can do if their kids come home one day with a book that goes against their faith, or in the workplace and they're asked to do something that goes against their faith. And so really we started F3 out of that need of a lot of what we've seen of young professionals that say, hey, I really want to do something here. I want to be a part of something bigger than myself. I want to know how to protect my family and my career. And I want to do something that makes a difference. And so we started that in April of 2024, and it's been about just under 2 years now.
Well, I might just mention, Shaun, that you are out in California, and of course you first heard about this. The initiative is to educate, equip, and empower young professionals. And as an individual that is very enthusiastic and a real go-getter, this seemed like an organization you should be a part of.
Oh, yeah. It absolutely is an organization that really casts vision and recognizes the value of religious liberty across America. And I think it's such a message that is pertinent that anyone who really grasps it really wants to be a part of it. And so once I heard and understood what First Liberty stands for and the reality that they're attempting to pull in young professionals, it was really a shoo-in for me.
Well, again, we have chapters coast to coast, but let's talk about what you have taking place there in California, because we do have a number of listeners in California, have a number of radio stations there, and this would be a place where they could get involved just right in their own community.
Oh, that's fantastic. So we've got groups in Sacramento, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Orange County, San Diego, and some ambassadors in Riverside. And what we're attempting to do is really start to bring these ambassadors together, hosting events, whether they want to build community amongst themselves, as well as educating the public. So if you want to bring us into a small group, like I met with someone this morning, where they ended up hosting a gathering from their men's group, and they brought me in to speak and share about First Liberty and educating them on religious liberty. And it was amazing to see these young men recognizing, oh man, this is something that resonates so deeply with my soul. It gives me something that I can do, I can invest in and support. And so as many opportunities that really are out there, you can find.
Nathan, let's talk about some of the other chapters, because you're in Texas, but I have seen that you really have chapters all over the country. And as listeners are here, if they can't find one in their local community, maybe they could start one. So talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. When we first started, we started in Dallas, where I am, and then where Shaun was in San Diego. And pretty quickly since then, you already heard all the California chapters that we have. But in Texas, we've added, last year we added an event in Houston. We have some ambassadors in just west of Dallas and Fort Worth. We're going to start an Austin chapter here soon. And then if we're going over the East Coast, we have people from Miami all the way up to New York and Boston. And Boston's actually one of our growing areas right now. We're going to be doing an event there in March. Really special event there in Boston that's formed in over a little under a year of, just like Shaun was saying, starting in a home, and now we have an event in Boston. And so, if there are places that aren't on our map that we don't have anyone yet, we definitely are always open for people that are like-minded that want to help us start new areas. And kind of our goal is to develop the entire country.
And again, just when you think about Boston, where you're talking about this being the 250th anniversary of this country, and in some respects, anybody who's ever been to Boston, last time I was there, took my daughter and we walked the Freedom Trail. And so you get a chance to see all of those activities. And yet, even though that is, along with Virginia and a number of other places, sort of the birthplace of the nation and the birthplace of religious liberty, things have turned the other direction. And so I think especially some of our listeners in Massachusetts and California, in Illinois, and a variety of other places probably see the need for these chapters even more so. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about how, in some respects, because of some of these Supreme Court decisions, and Nathan, I might even point out, I saw a video the other day, and I'm sure now I've heard about almost 2 million people have seen the video of your dad and some other people, Tim O'Hare and a variety of other people we've had on the program, unveiling a 10 Commandments monument there in Tarrant County, but that is happening all over the country. So I want to spend some time talking about what some of our younger listeners can do. And one of the reasons we always have a next generation roundtable is because we really want to reach out to that next generation. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So we'll take a break. We'll continue our conversation today with Nathan and Shaun. And if you find yourself interested, you can go to our website, and under both of their pictures are links to the F3 initiative. But let's continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Perhaps you've seen an internet meme that connects mathematics to the universe. It begins with a quote by Eugene Wigner, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who is considered one of the sharpest minds in quantum theory. He observes that the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious. Humans invented math to count, trade, and organize logic, yet the universe obeys equations with terrifying precision. Humans didn't invent math to explain the universe, yet not only explains it, but it predicts it as well. Math predicted antimatter before it was ever seen. Einstein's equations predicted black holes and gravitational waves decades before anyone could measure them. The equations came first, reality followed. If math were merely a tool that humans invented, why does it also explain the universe that secular scientists believe is merely running on blind chance? That is not what we would expect. One physicist explained it like this: it's like inventing a house key, then discovering it opens a door on another planet. Secular scientists may even find it dangerous because it asks a question science isn't built to answer. Why does the universe speak a language it never learned? Perhaps math isn't just a tool, perhaps it is the operating system of reality. Now, we aren't just studying the universe, we're also reading something that was written, and that suggests that there was a creator who created it. We're reading what he has written. It's not really that mysterious, it's only logical. Design implies a designer. A mathematical language of the universe implies an author. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the F3 initiative with First Liberty Institute with Nathan Shackelford and Shaun Frederickson. And again, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is go to our website today, pointofview.net. You'll see a couple of links, one which will take you to the idea of joinf3.org. Have another link to First Liberty. You can find their landing page there. You'll see a number of different videos that will give you some information. In just a minute, I want to talk with Shaun about how you can get a newsletter, how you can be an ambassador, how you can join. But I thought, Nathan, for just a minute, since as we were going to the break, I was talking about this new environment we find ourselves in because of some of these Supreme Court decisions that have come from First Liberty Institute. There are greater opportunities than ever. And in addition to the F3 hub that I want people to go to, there's another one called Restoring Faith in America. And in some respects, you're also encouraging people to say, maybe you've lived in a community where they took down the Ten Commandments monument. Now you can put it back up. And so there are all sorts of things, Nathan, that young people that are listening today can get involved right away in their own community, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we probably one of the worst cases we've had on religious freedom in a long time is one called Lemon v. Kurtzman. And in that case, they tried to essentially remove any type of government from religion, saying that there needs to be this separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution, and saying that private citizens can sue to take down monuments, religious monuments, when they're on government land. Well, we had a case for a coach up in Washington, Coach Kennedy, and when we won that case, that he could pray on the 50-yard line after football games, the ruling said that Lemon was done, which meant that now there is not this type of hesitancy to have religion back in the public square. And so that's why you've seen Ten Commandments going back up. If around Christmas, you might have seen nativity scenes or different things for Hanukkah going up. And that's because of the Lemon case being done and Kennedy being there and allowing people to really go on the offensive, which is what our Restoring Faith in America campaign is trying to get those monuments back up, nativity scenes back up, prayer back in places. It's an offensive movement really to try to take back our culture. And that's something our ambassadors work on with F3 as well. We have an activation committee or a team that basically what they try to do is that same thing. So we do have a group of activists as well within F3 that are looking to do that. And so that's definitely something we want to take advantage of with the law being on our side.
I want to come back to you in just a minute and talk about this issue of education, because learning is one of the elements of the F3 initiative. But Shaun, by now, I suspect there's some people saying, okay, I'm interested. How do I sign up? As they go to these two different links that we have on the website, they will see some of the videos of you. And so in some respects, people might say, well, how can I sign up and what am I signing up for? Can you help us out?
Absolutely. So if they've made it to joinf3.org, that's joinf3.org, then depending on if they're on their phone or on a desktop, it's top right corner, you're going to see an opportunity where you can click the ambassador link or learn or join the newsletter. So if you're just really curious about what First Liberty is doing and you want information, a good starting point might just be the newsletter for you. But if you're really interested in getting connected with other young professionals around the country, and maybe even applying some of the skills that you've got to stand up for religious liberty, then you can become an ambassador. So all you've got to do is click that ambassador link and fill out the form, which is applying some of your information, name, phone number, email address, and we will contact you and bring you into the F3 community and get you plugged in with information on who's in your area and how we can get you activated and stand up for religious liberty.
And I think probably some individuals that have come to your first meeting meet some others and say, I was beginning to think I was the only person in the community that was concerned about this. So developing those relationships is really key, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You'd be surprised how isolated people feel in Los Angeles or maybe San Francisco or Sacramento, that when we have a gathering really discussing the tenets and values of American history and religious liberty, and you can just relax and rest and recognize, oh, these are people that we're of the like mind, and you have the ability to build out with some great friends. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Well, let's, if we can, maybe educate people for a few minutes, because that's something, of course, that you are equipped to do. And Nathan, one of those issues is back to this idea of the Ten Commandments. In 1980, we had a case called Stone versus Graham. That's 45 years ago, but nevertheless, that was one that says you have to remove the Ten Commandments from the classroom there in Kentucky. And your generation has grown up hearing a phrase called separation of church and state. And I suspect that any of the young professionals you're working with probably need to be educated about whether or not that phrase is even in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a lot of people, when we do these events in homes, it's one of the questions that we typically ask of people is separation of church and state in the in the Constitution? And it's surprisingly a little better than you would think for the response rate. These people might be a little bit more aware of it, but I would say your average person would probably say yes. Sean's even done some videos in California asking people the same thing. And what we've seen is, people don't know where it comes from, and it's really originating from a letter to the Danbury Baptist Convention, where Jefferson is talking about not wanting the church really to be run by the state, for the state to become the authoritarian of what religion is inside the state. He wasn't saying that these two need to be separate, that there's no place for the church inside the state. He's saying that the state should not be involved in the church and running it just like the Church of England was back home. So that's where it comes from. But there's a lot of what we say is you can't fight for your rights if you don't know what they are. And so a lot of that just starts with, where did these things come from? What did the Coach Kennedy case allow us to do? And why can they put 10 Commandments in classrooms now, like we're seeing in Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana? And so we like to talk about a lot of those things and address those, make sure people feel confident about knowing what their rights are.
I was in a meeting the other day with an individual that has been listening to Point of View and immediately brought up this particular book that Howard Goldthwait, and I've known him since the 1980s because we were in a Bible study together, but No Better Letter is a resource that I've already heard some parents want to give to their children, or in many cases to their grandchildren. And so in some respects, this education can happen at the grade school level. I'm sure that what you are providing is at the young professionals level, and it does seem to me that this is the kind of education that you're all about there at F3 Initiative, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those books that we do, Howard does one of them for us a year about different topics with the founding and religious freedom, how that plays in. And our parents, that's something we definitely give parents is those books to read to their kids. And I get videos sent from ambassadors that are reading these books to their kids, and their kids are already starting to realize that the King of England was bad and that they needed separation. And so it's fun to see that being passed down. But we also have we're trying to kind of phase out that educational side to where we're trying to develop some educational materials now for younger kids through some civics curriculum, and then we have a group called CRCD. That really focuses on the college side and the academia type side. And so they do a lot of stuff in higher education. And so they're doing work on that education side. And for us, we want to educate the people that are out there raising kids and on the front lines and work.
This we can, when we come back, talk about the fact that you have a series of really very successful guides and resources that are available, the Religious Liberty Protection Kit, and I want to talk about some of that. And as we go to the break, this would be a perfect time for you, if you'd like to know a little bit more, to go to joinf3.org. Of course, we already have that link on the website. We also have another link to firstliberty.org, and if you go down to F3, you'll see their landing page that has some other material, lots of videos you can watch and the rest. So all of that is available at our website today at pointofview.net. But let me just make a comment or two before we take a break that we're still making available, for example, the booklet on a biblical view on gambling. Of course, we had football games over the weekend, and we will, of course, have a Super Bowl in 2 weeks. And I would certainly encourage you that since we've been writing and speaking about this issue of sports gambling and some of the various controversy, that is still on the website. You can download the booklet in that regard. We also, of course, have a booklet on church state and a variety of other resources that we make available, but I would encourage you right now to go to First Liberty and find some of those protection kits. We'll talk about that after the break. My Viewpoints commentary today has the interesting title, Math and the Universe. Turns out that we develop math as humans to really just try to learn how to count and to keep track of things. It wasn't invented to explain the universe, but guess what? It actually does only so well, and as one particular scientist said, it's like inventing a house key and then discovering it opens a door on another planet. Very good argument for the existence of God. We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again while you're talking about the F3 initiative, the Future of Faith and Freedom Initiative of First Liberty Institute. Nathan Shackelford with us, Shaun Frederickson. And Shaun, I thought I might come to you for just a minute because I've talked about these various booklets and the Religious Liberty Protection Kit. And I think by now people have figured out Nathan is really smart and knows a lot about law. But for those of us that did not go to law school, I thought that these booklets are great resources because you have the Religious Liberty Protection Kit for people in the military, for students and teachers in the public schools, even for those that are dealing with maybe religious nonprofits, and just the whole issue of your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for houses of worship. And these are written in such a way that whether you're a mom raising your kids, a pastor leading a school, maybe somebody working in the business world, these are some great resources that come from F3 Initiative.
Yes, you articulated that so well, Kerby. That's exactly what they are. They're great resources for people who are not so legal-minded. It's actually a fantastic tool for, like what you said, nurses, public school teachers, individuals that have churches of their own, or just Christians in the workforce. kind of gives you a breakdown of what your rights are. There are tense moments in the world where you might get challenged against what you believe, and these protection kits are really there to help you understand what rights you've got in the domain of your faith, so that if something happens, then you have the ability to kind of lean into that resource, and then you can always contact us. If you ever go to the firstliberty.org website, on the top right, there's a button there that's designed for the public, that if they've got questions about a scenario that they're in, they can reach out to us and we will gladly help them.
Let's begin talk about activism for just a minute, because, Shaun, that's something that you've been involved with. There has been this assumption, and I think there's reason to believe it, that the younger generation doesn't like conflict and all the polarization and the rest. But I've noticed a change, and part of that was when you were involved in some of these what we called anti-lockdown events. I think this has even hit a new level. You might want to call it the Charlie Kirk effect. After his death, there are more people signing up for these kinds of outreaches and the rest. And so in some respects, it seems to me that you are really poised to maybe take some of the frustration that your generation is feeling and channel it in a way that's going to have some productive and very significant outcomes.
Most certainly. We're recognizing that the responsibility of securing the future is really on our shoulders. Our generation has observed the chaos of the lockdowns, and I think a number of people through the past few years have recognized if we don't do something, then nobody might, which is a great recognition of our American Republic was secured through average American citizens who took up the responsibility of securing this republic. And so what we're doing is really producing opportunities for people to get involved, get connected, get educated, so that they have the capacity to, when they do stand up, that they do so properly and they can understand what they're doing.
Nathan, let's again talk about how, in some respects, the legal landscape has changed, and in some respects, that's helpful to the F3 initiative, because you mentioned, first of all, of course, Coach Kennedy. I've had a lot of young people say when they heard for the first time that a coach, on his own, after the game is over, going to the 50-yard line and prays for 40 or 50 seconds, that was seen as unconstitutional, that they just shook their head and say, "You got to be kidding me." And now when they hear that we have an individual who was an evangelist in Mississippi, and you have this case going out to the Supreme Court and saying you can't even share the gospel, again, I think some of that is a motivation for your generation to say, I think this wokeism has gone too far, this anti-religious bias has gone too far, and I need to do something to turn that around.
Yeah, I think if you've been around First Liberty as long as we have, you get less and less surprised by the types of cases that we see. You would think you'd be surprised, but I mean, if they'll go after a blind old woman in a park in the Northeast in Connecticut for sharing her faith in a park bench, what does that mean for everyone else? And so, yeah, the fact patterns that you see in these cases are just always insane. And we're seeing a lot more attacks on people sharing faith in public now. I'd say that's a big area that we've seen a lot of attacks in, is people don't want the gospel in public places. They don't want you to be able to share at a public event or at these open places. And so that's been a lot of our cases, including the one you mentioned for Gabriel Olivier, who was just trying to share his faith outside of a park. And when he was told he needed to move to this free speech zone, he refused to do it, got arrested, and now they're trying to tell him that he has no standing to bring a lawsuit. So it's just crazy, but that's what we try to do too with F3, is show people the types of cases that they'll see so that they know what types of things could happen and when we can get involved and help them.
I have not been involved as much as you have, but occasionally speaking on college campuses and other interactions, I've interacted a couple of times with ACLU lawyers. And my argument, Nathan, oftentimes has been, you treat religious speech as if it's pornography. As a matter of fact, you probably have a better attitude in the ACLU about pornography than you do about religion. And I think that idea that it would be inappropriate for somebody to pray on the 50-yard line, to share their faith as a blind woman, or to even present the gospel in a public forum, in some respects, what you are trying to do is help people bring it back to a level of balance, which my generation actually remembers, but your generation probably has never experienced.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear that people have of, we see all these attacks and people get worried, well, if I take a stand, well, if I'm vocal about my faith, it means I could come under attack, or I could end up in court. And so a lot of it's just education of telling people where the lines are, what they can do. I mean, you can't, there are limits on things. Like if you own a business, you can't use religion in promotions. Say, this person's my same religion, so I'm going to promote them. But it doesn't mean as a business that you can't put scripture all in your founding verses. So there are these different lines that people have to know. But when we know where the lines are, we know how we can be really confident in living out our faith and not feeling that kind of threat. Because there are people that don't want us to share that, because if people become faith-based people, it means that they have to take stands that there is a truth, that things aren't all black and aren't all gray, that there is right and wrong, and a lot of people don't want that.
That's so good. Shaun, let me come to you for just a minute. We've been talking about this idea of education, but one of the things that you want to do is to encourage and empower individuals. One of those ways is maybe at the lowest level, there are people that says, well, I'd like to know more, and your newsletter is just a quarterly newsletter. So that first step is not a major commitment, but it's one that puts you at least inside the circle, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. You can start to receive the language of religious liberty. The general public, including myself, before working with First Liberty so closely, I had no idea what I didn't know. I thought I was pretty informed. I thought I was pretty connected to the pulse of what's going on in the community, as well as politics and all that. But come to find out, there was a lot that I didn't see, simply because a lot of the media sources aren't doing the best of distributing cases that are really relevant and pertinent to people of faith. And so that newsletter really does well to help focus on cases that we are arguing, wins that are significant, and important information about standing up for your faith in your community where you're at, and kind of give you the tools that way you can stand up for your faith in the workforce, or help encourage your pastor to stand up boldly. And that's really the desire, is not necessarily getting anybody to move outside of their comfort zone, but take up the mantle of religious liberty right there in that comfort zone. Because we can gradually push America back into the framework of a religious liberty-minded nation, but we have to do it together.
Let's also talk about the idea of being an ambassador, because that might be the next step. What does that entail?
Yeah, an ambassador is a person who is a leader in their community that wants to take on that next step into First Liberty, where they love the cases, they understand what we're doing, and they want to be a voice for promoting the message of religious liberty. So it might be hosting an event locally so you can get some friends together, like I made mention of earlier. It could be at your church, or it could be, I've done one at a cigar bar. You can gather people wherever you'd like and talk about the value of religious liberty and recognizing that this country stands in the liberty we have because of it. And then on top of that, we have other events, regional events that you can attend and bring people to as well.
Very good. Let's take a break. We'll continue for just a few more minutes after the break, talking about the F3 initiative. Again, you can go to firstliberty.org or go to joinf3.org. Either one will work. We have links to both of those on the website. You can find out more about Nathan and Shaun. We'll be back right after these messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a conversation about the F3 initiative at First Liberty Institute for a few more minutes. Nathan Shackelford with us, Shaun Frederickson. And Shaun, I thought it was interesting. I looked at the Global Ambassador Network. And of course, not only do you have people in the United States, but in other countries around the world, Europe and Asia, even Australia. Our guest next hour is Simon Kennedy. In the second hour, part of the hour, he will be talking about Worldview, but he's at the University of Queensland Law School. So as far away as Australia, you have individuals. But what should someone do if they look on the map and there's nothing in their community? Is there a way that they can start a particular community? Is there a way that they can become an ambassador and then attract other members? How do they go about doing that?
That is exactly what we're looking for, is growth, and recognizing that if there isn't anyone in your area, we are ready to start building. So whether you're in Seattle or Portland, it doesn't matter, across the country, we're looking for ambassadors who are recognizing the duty is ours to stand up and protect religious liberty. And so be that first person in your city and your community. We'll come around you and support you with the resources that you need to get that community off the ground and really help move the needle in that area.
You know, one of the things, Nathan, I thought we might talk about is just a reason to be optimistic. We've already talked about many of the cases that First Liberty Institute has won. I would add to that some other cases that Alliance Defending Freedom have won as well. And, of course, we don't know about the case of Gabe Olivier, but I'm pretty sure the Supreme Court is going to rule in his favor as well. So there seems to me to be more opportunity now than ever before, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you have a Supreme Court that will follow the laws that's written and not try to create their own law, then we should be in a place that is very strong for religious freedom, because that's what our country was founded on. That's what the First Amendment is about, is freedom of religion and freedom for people to express that religion without fear of reprisal. And I think the Supreme Court is upholding that right now, and we're seeing lots of really precedent-shifting things, and a lot of stuff now that we're seeing about parental rights that we've seen at the Supreme Court over the last little bit. And so taking different things as it comes, but I think right now one of the biggest battlegrounds is parents being able to raise their kids according to their beliefs and not having the state interfere with that. And so we've had a case out of California dealing with that. We just had a case at the Supreme Court dealing with that as well for vaccine requirements on parents. And so we're seeing this a lot more in the country of parents wanting to take a stand, and Supreme Court being a lot more for religious freedom than they have been in the past.
Well, and again, that case out of California is one in which a young man, and I mean very young man, a grade school young man, was standing up and saying, I don't feel right about reading this particular book that really encourages gender fluidity, and I'm being nice about what they actually talk about there, and then found himself all of a sudden speaking in front of the President of the United States because your father and others invited him to actually be an individual as an illustration of why we have a National Religious Liberty Commission. And again, I've been around long enough, Shaun, I don't remember ever a time in which you've had a president who's initiated a National Religious Liberty Commission, and that's exactly what we have right now here in the United States.
Yeah, it's pretty unprecedented times where we have two more religious liberty commissions, and it's really quite special having Kelly Shackelford, the CEO of First Liberty, as one of the commissioners, where he has the ability to share with the president his understanding of religious liberty and then bring in individuals to testify about the need and the value of religious liberty, like Shay Encinas, like you mentioned before, where he got his 60 seconds to meet the president of the United States and share precisely what took place to him. And then his mother also had the opportunity to testify. And these type of opportunities are unprecedented, and it's really special to be a part of it.
Well, and again, if I could add one more, the head of the Religious Liberty Commission is Dan Patrick, along with, of course, Ben Carson. But Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas, he was over in Davos the other day. This is, again, the gathering of the elites in Davos, Switzerland. And he's out there, and somebody's asking why he's up there. I said, well, because he was speaking on, are you ready for this? Religious liberty in front of those people from Europe and Africa and Asia and other places places. And so I think we are really seeing almost a snowball effect that I think is something that you at F3 Initiative can really capture and really begin to build some enthusiasm for the younger generation to go out there and to begin to proclaim the fact that we do have those rights. And if nothing else, that's why we encourage people to find out more about your initiative.
Amen to that. I wholly agree that the first step is recognizing that you're needed. I think there's a lot of people that think someone else will do that courageous thing in their community, but it is amazing the number of clients that we've had at First Liberty who are just average people who've taken a stand, like Coach Kennedy. He's just an average guy that chose to pray, and when he was told that he couldn't do it, he happened to find himself at the Supreme Court, and he changed a 50-year precedent because he knew something was wrong. And that's really the heartbeat of what F3 is educating young professionals to know right and wrong. That way we can stand when the Lord provides the opportunity.
Again, Shaun, one more time, I thought I might just mention the fact that when you go to the website, join the newsletter, become an ambassador, you can sign in. There's a button that says give, and certainly if they can believe that this is something that is worth their financial investment, and I believe that it is, they can give to that in a special way. And so there are ways in which right now, no matter what your age is, you can get involved either inside or on the outside, encouraging F3, don't you think?
Most certainly. We need all the support that we can get. As we are growing, we're about 2 years into this F3 initiative. And the more support, the more eager individuals that we have around the country, the more growth we'll have, and the more religious liberty that will be produced because of it.
Well, Nathan and Shaun, I appreciate you being with us today. And again, anytime people would like to contact you, there's information there about the F3 initiative. We have that available already on our website. You can click on the picture of Nathan Shackelford and hit the button that says visit the website, or you can hit the one that says Shaun Frederickson, and that one will take you to the First Liberty website, and then just scroll down to Finding F3. Both of them are great resources for you to find, but if you're just looking for one place to go, just go to joinf3.org. And I appreciate both of you joining with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having us.
Kerby.
Well, let's, if we can, take a break. And when we come back, we're at a little bit of a limitation here. I've got Steve actually both being producer and engineer, and so the two of us are making this work. Given the inclement weather is dying off, we'll be back to full strength tomorrow. When we come back, I do want to spend some time talking about some of these very important issues. A piece by Jonathan Turley, which first of all reminds us of the importance of free speech, and part of that, of course, would be even free speech for individuals with religious convictions. And also, he, I think, has done a very good job of answering some of the false ideas that were presented, the idea of the bait boy story hoax. So we'll get into that for a few minutes when we talk about Minnesota. Then there, as if you have not noticed, the price of gold has just shot up. And I wanted to tell you the backstory. What's going on? Why is the price of gold and now silver and other things going up so dramatically? I think it points to some very significant economic issues we need to address. Then, just on a positive note, I thought it would be good to go to a very good piece by Robert George, How to Keep Our Republic. You might remember the story of, as Benjamin Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, a woman asked, Mr. Franklin, what have you given us? And his answer was, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. So we're going to talk about some very important aspects of the way in which we can be involved, and then we'll spend some time talking about this book on Worldview.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today as we talk about the F3 initiative. In the first hour, now we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. Hope you appreciated that. And if you didn't have a chance to hear it, of course, you can always go to our website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says watch or listen and listen to it again or pass it on to others who might need to know about that. But let's, if we can, at least focus a little time and attention on Minnesota. And one of the phrases that Marlon Maddox, the host of Point of View, used to use is, I'll be honest with you. He oftentimes would say, let me be honest with you. And I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I don't know what to believe on some of these issues. And when you start seeing various people posting this picture, that picture, this video, that video, coming to a conclusion, I think you have to recognize that at the heat of the moment, there are probably some examples of a bad shoot, as the people said, and so we won't get into that today, although there's a very good piece that I am going to have posted for tomorrow by Joshua Arnold, Godly Justice Establishes Facts First, a biblical response to the Minneapolis shooting. So we'll get into that, but since I don't have a lot of time, because at the bottom of the hour, we're going to have Simon Kennedy with us as we talk about Worldview, I did think that it would be appropriate to at least post this piece by Jonathan Turley. And the reason for that is because he's not necessarily seen as an individual who is supportive of the Trump administration. As you've heard me say before, he's an individual that is a professor at George Washington University. I think probably always has voted for a Democrat. If we had the video on right now, I would show his book, An Indispensable Right, which is a whole very good book by an individual on the issue of free speech. Nevertheless, he has again pointed out that what we have right now is clickbait on this, what we might call the bait boy story hoax. And he's not the only one writing about that. I've posted his article, but just as easily could have posted a piece by Cal Thomas called The Wrong Narrative. And these, of course, are stories about this young 5-year-old boy that was used as bait to get his father to come out, and he was kidnapped by ICE, and, of course, all the statements being made. And Jonathan Turley mentions that this is very reminiscent of what we ran into before, because the former Vice President Kamala Harris said, I'm outraged and you should be as well, and reminds us that she was outraged 5 years ago about the story. It was, again, a false story about border agents whipping migrants in Texas. And at that time, you had so many people, Representative Maxine Waters and a variety of others, others describing it as slavery, white supremacist behavior. President Biden accused the agents of doing all sorts of irresponsible things. And, of course, it was a false story. It was exposed as a false story. And as Jonathan Turley points out, the media just shrugged and went on their way. Cal Thomas gives us another example of a false story, and that is the hands up, don't shoot. That goes back further to 2014, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. But we have these stories that almost have a life of their own, but they are false. And so I thought it was appropriate to have Jonathan Turley, who's not necessarily seen by anybody as a Trump supporter, nevertheless expressing his concern about the fact that these kinds of stories come out again and again. And so with this new hoax, he quotes from a representative in Minnesota who is very concerned and said, if you're not outraged, then you're not human. And of course, the whole story is, I think, an illustration of something we talk about so often on Point of View, the need for us to have discernment. Jonathan Turley reminds us that the term post-truth was chosen by Oxford dictionaries as the word of the year, and they actually at the time pointed out that post-truth was ascribed to President Trump. But in this case, oftentimes, as Jonathan Turley, who would, I think, describe himself as a liberal, points out that his fellow liberals oftentimes are much more guilty of post-truth than conservatives are. And he says the bait boy hoax is particularly disgraceful. He says, first of all, it is common to have minor children present during arrests. Officers will try to get family members to take a child rather than put him into child services. In this case, the ICE officers are trying to detain an individual, a national from Ecuador. He bolted and left behind his 5-year-old child. Rather than leave the child in the freezing cold on the street, the officers took the child to his home to get his mother to take him in. She refused to open the door. Even when they gave assurances that she was not going to be detained, they could not actually get a family member to take the child. So, again, you won't see this in the mainstream media. I watched the ABC report, and it was just terrible. I mean, just terrible. This is bad journalism. They took the boy to McDonald's, played his favorite music, took care of him, and eventually his father asked that the boy be allowed to stay with him at the detention facility. And that's actually a home, but nevertheless, we'll call it the detention facility. And as a result, you have, again, some of the concerns. Jonathan Turley says one can have good faith objections to immigration enforcement policies. I think there are some surfacing right now. The Trump administration has made it a priority to deport these undocumented migrants, and this is something he pledged to do in the campaign. But it's a good example, he says, of these post-truth statements being made. And, of course, then he goes into talking about some of the really disgusting things that have been said about the fact that Caroline Leavitt is pregnant. And, of course, Husha basically Vance is pregnant, and all the really horrible things that have been said about their pregnancy and about them in particular. Is this turning around? Possibly. Last night, as somebody pointed out, something you might not have expected, but local and state police in Minneapolis and Minnesota arrested anti-ICE demonstrators once they had broken the law. They were demonstrating outside of the Spring Hill Suites in Marriott in Maple Grove, Minnesota. At one point, this went beyond First Amendment peaceful demonstration into something that was more agitated, and the police at this point no longer considered that to be peaceful, and individuals in the criminal acts were not at that point protected under the First Amendment and were subject to arrest. We have seen, of course, also a conversation, a phone call between President Donald Trump and Governor Tim Walz, and maybe some of this will tone down a little bit. But as I've said before, sometimes you don't know what to believe. I know a few things we should certainly reject. Number one, not to have the head of Homeland Security refer to the individual who was shot as a domestic terrorist. And I think we could also agree that we should not allow the governor or even the mayor in Minnesota and Minneapolis, respectively, to refer to ICE agents, which are individuals simply trying to do their job as the Gulag, as the Gestapo, as Nazis or something of that nature. But we'll get into that more tomorrow because it deserves a longer conversation. But if you've been hearing this story about this bait boy, this 5-year-old bait boy, I wanted to maybe post something by an individual less likely to support the Trump administration, but still an individual that recognizes we live in this post-truth world, and maybe we need a lot more discernment and maybe willing to get the facts before we jump to conclusions. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Perhaps you've seen an internet meme that connects mathematics to the universe. It begins with a quote by Eugene Wigner, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who is considered one of the sharpest minds in quantum theory. He observes that the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious. Humans invented math to count, trade, and organize logic, yet the universe obeys equations with terrifying precision. Humans didn't invent math to explain the universe, yet not only explains it, but it predicts it as well. Math predicted antimatter before it was ever seen. Einstein's equations predicted black holes and gravitational waves decades before anyone could measure them. The equations came first, reality followed. If math were merely a tool that humans invented, why does it also explain the universe that secular scientists believe is merely running on blind chance? That is not what we would expect. One physicist explained it like this: it's like inventing a house key, then discovering it opens a door on another planet. Secular scientists may even find it dangerous because it asks a question science isn't built to answer. Why does the universe speak a language it never learned? Perhaps math isn't just a tool, perhaps it is the operating system of reality. Now, we aren't just studying the universe, we're also reading something that was written, and that suggests that there was a creator who created it. We're reading what he has written. It's not really that mysterious, it's only logical. Design implies a designer. A mathematical language of the universe implies an author. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, listen, we can maybe talk about two articles I've posted that will affect your life. If you live in Minnesota, the story we just talked about might affect you, but this certainly will. And it comes from the Wall Street Journal. The golden age arrives, if not as planned. The metals rise to $5,000 an ounce as a market vote of declining confidence. Just looked it up. The price of gold, not that I'm planning on buying any, $51.55. So $5,100 dollars for just a 1 ounce gold coin. I've driven cars not worth as much as that one gold coin. So I guess we are dealing with something that is concerning. The editors put it this way: gold's ascent above $5,000 per ounce, or some might say the dollar's drop to less than 1/5,000th of an ounce of gold, is one of the signals that something is wrong. Here's some ways to think about this. Gold, and of course we'd also say silver, but we'll focus on gold for just a minute, is a barometer of belief. Last week, you might know that on Friday we spent some time talking about the World Economic Forum. At the World Economic Forum, it was rather depressing, unless you listen to the speech by Donald Trump, who believes we're headed to a golden age. But the bottom line is that you were hearing so many statements being made by individuals that you wouldn't necessarily have expected to have said that. I'm thinking, for example, of the BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink, who also serves as the co-chair of the World Economic Forum, talking about the fact that a lot of people don't trust us anymore. You think? And so there has been a great deal of concern there. You had Ray Dalio of Bridgewater Capital talking about the fact that this whole monetary order seems to be breaking down, which again makes sense, since if you look on my bookshelf, you'll see two of his books. One's called The Changing World Order, and the other is How Countries Go Broke. What is happening right now is not just happening in the United States. As a matter of fact, Scott Bessett and others are saying the same thing. Usually when you have a change, and I know right now a lot of people are talking about the fourth turning, and I wrote about that in our booklet on various trends, what you do is oftentimes see one empire declining and another taking over. That's not happening. China actually is dealing with worse economic issues than we are. So this idea that China is going to take over, although it is very dangerous, and we're hoping maybe we can get Gordon Chang or somebody on to talk about what's going on in China. But right now, China's debt to GDP, 290%. Which is much more than we have in the United States. You look at Japan. I was hoping that if we had the video going today, I'd show a picture of the Japanese yen just dropping off the table while the price of gold going up. And that's telling me again that some things are not well, not just in the United States, but around the world. As some people have said, well, the world is on fire and the safest house right now is the United States. So that shows you that there are some really incredible problems unfolding. And of course, Japan used to have 0% interest. So they would say, buy our debt. And in some cases, they even had negative. We'll pay you to buy our debt, but we'll give you almost nothing. So there was what was known as the Japanese or the yen carry trade, where people would borrow money from Japan and invest it where they were getting money. And this was known as the carry trade. Right now, the federal government is actually set up to buy the Japanese yen. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow. But this article about how the gold prices are going up illustrates again there are all sorts of problems. Of course, the editors of the Wall Street Journal want to lay some of the blame on the part of Donald Trump in terms of the tariff war, and some of that uncertainty is there. But then they go on to remind us all the things I've talked about. The prime minister there really trying to expand government spending because the interest rates are where they certainly should not be. They talk about China and even the possibility that China may be doing so poorly that they might even be more inclined to actually invade Taiwan. So this is a dangerous world, and in a time when maybe too many people are fixated on what's happened in Minnesota. Not that that story isn't important. There's a reminder that the world is facing major economic problems. The global debt, this is all of the debt, not just the United States, but all the countries, $251 trillion. There is something seriously wrong, and it's something we'll be watching for some time, and that will affect you. You might say, well, whatever happens to Japan doesn't affect us. No, it does affect us, and that's something we will continue to talk about economically. Which brings me to the last piece before we talk about Worldview with Simon Kennedy, and that is a very good piece that came out from Professor Robert George. We've had him on the program, professor at Princeton, an individual that has written this piece about how to keep our republic. Now, where does that phrase come from? Well, back in 1787, on the last day of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin went for a walk, and he encountered a woman who was a well-known socialite who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Robert George says, well, we're going to have to do some work to keep it, because he points out that if you look at the December 2025 Gallup poll, it found that just 25% of Americans were satisfied with the direction of this country. A political poll from about a month earlier found that 49% of Americans thought that this country's best times were in the past. Fortunately, at least 41% thought that our best times are yet to come. So obviously, there is a concern on the part of the American people about the future of America and what that might be. And so Robert George reminds us that our civic and political structures remain fundamentally intact, even if they've been sometimes pushed to the limits in recent years and decades. The government is still functioning, although I think we're headed for another shutdown by certainly February, but we'll see. But he says what we are missing is the foundation of that. What we're missing is virtue. As a matter of fact, we have a appeal letter coming out that we are sending to you, in which we talk about some of the statements that George Washington and Abraham Lincoln made about those issues as well. Because our political culture rests upon a moral culture of the people. Virtues must exist, and virtues must be nurtured by each generation. So he says that the basic institutions of civil society. That would be the family, religious communities, even private organizations, are what promote what we call civic virtue. And they're indispensable in transmitting those essential virtues. Unfortunately, he also concludes that it is difficult to conceive of a moment in our nation's history when institutions devoted to the cultivation of virtue have been weaker. This brings us back to kind of the subtitle of his piece, which was Little Platoons Have Large Consequences. Again, you might say, what's little platoons? Well, it goes back to Edmund Burke, who referred to these institutions I just mentioned, the family, churches, religious organizations, private organizations, as little platoons. They were, if you will, the essential building blocks of virtue. They worked together to educate and encourage virtue, and in some respects try to promote that in the citizenry. So again, the solution to many of our problems we're dealing with right now really can't be found in politics. They can be solved by the growth of these little platoons. So lots of times people say, I'm really concerned about the division in this country. Well, we're not going to find answers on social media. We're not going to find answers by going to Washington, D.C., or Tallahassee, Florida, or Albany, New York, or perhaps Sacramento, California, Austin, Texas. Those are going to come from the communities. We need to be building strong families. We need to be building strong churches. We need to be building strong institutions that actually promote virtue. That's why I'm so positive about the Christian school movement. That's why I'm so encouraging individuals to get involved in their local church, because those are really the answers to how to keep our republic. Very good piece by Robert George. I've given you a very short summary of about 4 pages, but I would encourage you to read it. We've had him on the program before. We think very highly of him. And I have a commentary coming out next week where I focus once again on his speech on how to keep our republic. Let's take a break. When we come back, we talk about worldview so often. Simon Kennedy has some concerns about the way we teach worldview, and since we talk about it so often here on Point of View, it seemed like a good book to talk about with him. He is in Australia, so he had to get up early, stay up late, I'm not sure which, and he'll join us by phone right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know we use the idea of worldview, Christian worldview. We quote from different individuals that have used that phrase. We've had people on the program that talk about developing a Christian worldview, and yet at the same time, there are some that have said perhaps it is worth a reevaluation, maybe some of the foundations for what we oftentimes refer to a worldview. Maybe you're a little bit shaky. Maybe there's some complexities we need to address. So that's why we thought we might spend some time today talking about this book, Against Worldview, Reimagining Christian Formation as Growth in Wisdom. And it is written by Simon Kennedy. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago when we were talking about our other guest, Senior Research Fellow at Alpha Crucis University College, also at the University of Queensland Law School. And he joins us by phone from Australia. And so, Simon, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on, Kerby. It's good to be here talking to you from the future, apparently.
And again, I don't know if you had to stay up late or get up early, but I appreciate it, and I think we have a very good connection. And so one of the things early on in the book that you use as a metaphor, and I may use it when I teach on it, is the idea of a mosaic. All the little bits and pieces that come together that give you the whole picture. And I think in some respects, that's something that you begin the book with, and then you come back to it in your last chapter. So let's see if we can explain that to our listeners first.
Sure. I imagine a worldview as a beautiful work of art. And it's something that we're working on and that God's working on with us, and that our teachers and professors and so on, whoever's teaching us, our pastors, our parents, are all working on together with us. If you're a student, if you're an adult, it doesn't really matter who you are. I understand worldview is something that we're working towards, and it's a beautiful work of art, a picture of how reality is that only God sees. He's the master craftsman. He can see reality. He can see the truth clearly, and we're really only grasping at that reality in limited ways. And so I imagine worldview formation as a process of building a beautiful mosaic. And so I think about a beautiful mosaic on the roof of a church. The classic one, probably one of the most famous ones, is the ceiling of the Gala Placidia in Ravenna in Italy. And you have this incredible image of Christ and of other biblical imagery that are all, it's made up of tiny little tiles. And so each piece of learning we do, each thing that we learn is a tile in that mosaic of a Christian worldview, a proper understanding of reality. So that's how I imagine worldview formation, and in a way it's a building project or an artistic project.
Might even encourage people, if they're near a computer, look up the Mausoleum of Gallia Placidia. I didn't say Placidia, and you can see that. But the other part of that is the subtitle of your book, and that has to do with wisdom, because your argument is really what we're trying to do is teach wisdom. You just a minute ago were, I'm sure, talking with both my producer and my engineer today, because he's doing both jobs, and he was teaching wisdom in the Christian schools. And that's really what we're teaching, wisdom and discernment. And in some respects, you can have all the facts of a worldview, but if you're not necessarily gaining Christian maturity, wisdom, and maybe discernment, then we've maybe missed our task. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. When we think about the concept of wisdom in the Bible, really, wisdom is an educational concept, isn't it? If you think about the book of Proverbs, which is a book about wisdom, it's a father teaching his son. And growing in wisdom is about growing in maturity, and that's a really important New Testament concept as well. God, in Christ and through the work of the Holy Spirit, is growing us in maturity, which is in wisdom. And so, in the book of Proverbs and in the life of different wise people in the Scriptures, we can see how God gives people particular kinds of wisdom. So, in the building of the tabernacle, He gives particular men wisdom, and the word used there is the word wisdom, to build particular parts of the tabernacle and to make beautiful pieces of artwork in the tabernacle. He gives Solomon the wisdom of kings and David the wisdom of kings. He gives Solomon what we might call scientific wisdom, an understanding of birds and animals and plants. And there's various other kinds of wisdom as well, household management, business management, agriculture, and so on. These are all depicted in the Bible as wisdom in one form or another. And so that, to me, seems like a better biblical concept for thinking about education than worldview. So I really, in the book, I want to zero in on this idea of wisdom. I'm not discarding worldview. The title sounds like I'm discarding the idea of worldview, but I'm not.
No.
I'm reframing it and thinking about it as growth in wisdom rather than simply growth in a particular kind of knowledge.
By the way, your book's been out a while, and I've actually read another review or two of your book from people that teach worldview and said, you're really raising some very good concerns. So I don't want people to think, be put off by the title. But you do mention how this developed. Abraham Kuyper, not a name we mention too often. Francis Schaeffer, oftentimes we mention him when we're talking with Doug Groothuis. Of course, we've had Chuck Colson, Nancy Pearcey, Jim Sire. Matter of fact, I've got some of those books from them on my table here. If we had the video up right now, people could see that those are books we have used. And in some respects, your concern is that the foundation isn't as firm as people would like to believe. Can you explain that to us?
There's a long and interesting history for worldview, but it goes all the way back to the late 19th century. So the idea actually is relatively recent if you take an account of all of Christian history. However, the foundations of it they came from a time when Christians were facing a cultural crisis in one sense. They were facing a rising secularism, the ideas of someone like Friedrich Nietzsche, Charles Darwin, and other important intellectual conflicts that were occurring in Europe and in North America and across the world at the time, which were coming into conflict with Christianity. And so the idea of Christian worldview was formed by Abraham Kuyper and other people in that late 19th century era as a way of, how I understand it is, it's a way of Christians articulating who they are and what they believe in the face of unbelief. And that's a good thing to do. I'm all for Christians doing that, and I think that the worldview has been a helpful concept. And as you say, it was developed further by people like Francis Schaeffer. But in the end, this idea is really more of a culture war or cultural combat concept. It doesn't really form at the intellectual and spiritual basis for education. Education is really a constructive project. It's a positive thing to do. We're building something. We're building a Christian mind. We're building, a Christian life. We're growing in Christian wisdom, whereas worldview originally was a more negative concept. It was a concept that was used to fight against false ideas. And so I bring that into question, Kerby, because I think that isn't really the best basis for thinking about Christian education. Hence the need to, I think, revert to something more like growing in wisdom as a picture of what we're doing when we're growing a worldview.
Sure. And Chapter 3 is How Do We Learn? Education as a Building Project. And Chapter 4 is Education as Growing in Wisdom. And it seems to me that as much as we are sort of a facts-based culture, real goal, you should say, what is my end goal? If you think that the end goal is to have Christian students in Christian schools produce papers that have Bible verses, well, that's not an end goal. That's a means to get to the goal. If indeed you want to produce mature Christians who are thinking biblically about every area of life and continually applying biblical ideas with wisdom, that seems to be our goal. And sometimes we forget what the output should be. And ultimately, we want wise and discerning Christians, not just individuals that write good papers or can maybe fill out various multiple choice questions on a test about worldview. Is that maybe a distinction that you would appreciate?
Yeah, I think that's really well put, and maybe an anecdote would help illustrate the problem that you articulated really well. When I was a professor at a Christian college here in Australia, in Queensland, in fact, where I live now, previously, and it's a really good institution. I don't have any criticism of it now. So when I tell this story, I don't want any of my former colleagues to think I'm having a go at them. But when I was a professor there, I encountered a simplistic approach to this idea of Christian worldview, which basically said, if we have class devotions or we put enough Christian Bible verses in the content, if we ensure that we're saying Christian words and Christian things in our classes, then we're giving our students a Christian worldview approach or a Christian worldview angle to the topic that we're teaching. And I found this really frustrating because I don't think that that's actually giving students very much at all. It seems to me quite watery or quite watered down, if you will. Whereas actually what we're wanting to give them is something quite meaty, quite substantial. We want to give them the truth. And as Francis Schaeffer famously said, all truth is God's truth. And so it's a really important thing that we need to do is to give people the truth.
We're going to take a break and continue our conversation with Simon Kennedy, Against Worldview. And if you'd like to know more about his book, we have information about that on our website. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Simon Kennedy. Again, he is Senior Research Fellow at Alpha Christus University College, University of Queensland Law School. Also a non-resident fellow at the Danube Institute in Budapest, which I wanted to check out more about because, Simon, I make my way to Budapest oftentimes to speak at Word of Life, but another great connection there as well, so people can find out more about you. If they go to our website, we have a place where you can get a copy of the book. You might find it in your local bookstore, but probably unlikely since it's been out for a while. So we have it so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And I thought we might talk about what this looks like for many of our listeners. If they are maybe teachers, then they could be teachers in a Christian school. They could be parents who want to educate their kids about worldview. It could be, for example, maybe Sunday school teachers or Bible fellowship teachers. In some respects, you're talking about education is growing in wisdom. You also have a chapter on when do we arrive, because it does seem to me that people maybe are thinking, okay, Simon, I hear that. What would maybe you change in terms of how you would involve young people in the educational process? Or even if you're educating adults, what would you maybe see as your ultimate goal? Can you explain maybe that for us?
Yeah, sure. One of the key things I would recommend, I guess, flowing out of the ideas that I unpack in the book is that Christian educators should refocus on teaching sound Christian doctrine. And I use the phrase catechesis, but that's really it's an ancient word, really, that we use to describe teaching the basic truths of Christianity. And the distinction I'm making here is between doctrine and worldview. Often with worldview, we take these high-level tenets about reality and truth. So think about James Sire's book. It's a really classic example of these questions that he asks about reality. They're good questions to ask and talk about, and I'm not against doing that. But I think actually the most formative thing we can do as Christians and the most formative thing we can impart to our students is teaching the scriptures and teaching Christian doctrine, and that can undergird all the other learning that students do. It's not so much worldview questions, worldview surveys, worldview discussion that does that. I think it's God's word and the truths about God that the Bible teaches that do that. So that's the first thing that I think educators, whether they're parents, whether they're Sunday school teachers, Bible fellowship teachers, professors, whatever it is you're doing, that seems like a foundational thing to do. Another thing I think we should think about is when we think about growing in wisdom, we need to think about wisdom as a really broad concept. As I said before, wisdom works itself out in different ways, and wisdom is practical. Wisdom always works itself out practically. So it's not just head knowledge.
Right.
One danger with worldview approaches to things, Kerby, is that we tend to just want to get the right answers. As you say, you do a good job in the exam, you have the right Bible verses to back up your point in whatever academic exercise you're doing. But that's not enough. And so what we want to do is think about wisdom and the wisdom that God is wanting to give us as very practical, as much as it is head knowledge. And it also works itself out in lots of different ways. So, as I said before, Solomon, even though he obviously had a lot of aspects of his life that weren't wise, and we know that from his biography and from other, different writings he has in the Bible, he also was a wise king. He was a successful king, and he learnt a lot about the world that God had made. And so we can see that as an example of there's a breadth of wisdom there. Students don't just have to know answers to worldview questions, but they can actually learn about God's creation in really rich and wonderful ways. And then they can use that wisdom to give glory to God and to teach other people about God and about what he's made in the world. that's just one example. People can be very wise practically. They can build things, they can fix things, they can create new technologies. These are all ways of people using the wisdom that God has given us to glorify Him and to make the world a better place. So I think we can broaden our vision of what Christian education is about, and also broaden our vision of what worldview education is about at the same time, through these particular, these are some particular aspects that I would want educators to think about.
Again, maybe even brings us back to the idea of homeschooling, because you talk about the fact that education really is the science of relations. And sometimes when you have a teacher standing in front of 20 or 30 kids, there's not a lot of relations. They later then get on their phones and they have zero relations. And ultimately, the other aspect of what I picked up from your book was that the worldview is more gained by induction. In other words, you sort of figure out reality, and some of that is more hands-on. And so there's a sense in which we maybe have an old medieval, maybe a sort of a teaching like the guilds, if you will, of the Middle Ages, where one person lectures and everybody listens. And that hasn't worked terribly well. And ultimately, if our goal is wisdom, good, sound relationships, a wise and discerning individual, that maybe is involving this whole aspect of wisdom with worldview. We make sure you're thinking right, but if you're not acting right, or if all that worldview does is puff you up, to use a biblical phrase, I think you're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that wisdom comes from partly from relationships. So it's head knowledge, but in order for us to know whether our children or our students are wise, we have to know them, don't we? We have to see them living. We have to live alongside them.
Yes.
This recalls the idea of discipleship, doesn't it? Where you walk alongside. The student walks alongside the teacher and learns from how they live, not just what they teach in terms of head knowledge and in the intellectual life as well. So maybe this does support homeschooling. And my wife and I homeschool our children, which is actually a more unusual thing to do in Australia than it is in the United States. But it's not the only way to do it. I think that Christian schools can do a very good job of this as well, especially, as you say, if there's real relationship between the student and the teacher.
Well, again, I think you've certainly brought a lot to the conversation there. As an individual that is certainly well aware of the political issues and those kinds of things as well, I certainly have benefited from the writing. And most importantly, I did want people to know about this book. About 120 pages, very readable. It is one that I would certainly commend to those of you that are teaching worldview. So whether you're a teacher in a Christian school, whether you're a parent and your kids are in Christian or public school, certainly if you're a parent of a homeschooler, you might want to think through some of this. And so, Simon, I was unaware of you and unaware of the book, but once we found out a little bit more about it, we checked into it and thought it would be great to, if nothing else, get you up early in the morning and spend a little bit of time talking about this very important issue. So I appreciate you being willing to join us for a half an hour, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Well, Kerby, I'd be glad to come back on, and I really appreciate you having me on. Thanks for that.
Let's see, we can take a break, and then tomorrow we're going to get into all sorts of other issues. You can certainly understand that we'll be dealing with certainly some of the things in the news, but I wanted to take a little bit of time to get into some of those topics in a little bit more detail. But let's just, before we wind down for today, mention again that we have some take action items. We have my Viewpoints commentary, which again is the title Math and the Universe. Now, the reason I use that is because Dr. Eugene Wigner, who's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and an individual probably best known for some of the work he's done in quantum theory, nevertheless talks about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and the natural sciences as something bordering on the mysterious. Why so? Because we really developed math, we thought, just to know how to count and keep track of things, but instead it actually really just opened up, I'd probably be a better way to say it, what is going on in the universe. So just a very powerful argument, I think, for the existence of a creator God. But we certainly encourage you also to find some of the other articles we've posted, and I hope you will join us tomorrow. But most importantly, I want to thank Steve Miller, who has been everything from the engineer to the producer. He's been the one man behind the scenes making it all happen. So again, we appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.